Okay. I say you give it the rest of the minute because people are always late, coming in.
Yeah, all those back-to-back Zoom meetings.
I've only had 2 this morning so far.
Yeah, this is my first of the day, but it's only because I was at the dentist this morning. So yeah.
Yes,
Me
I do
too.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'd like to welcome Kat Volk from Lunar and Planetary Lab. And Kat, I'd like to ask you to just, give a little bit about your background because we do have some, people from a variety of backgrounds here, and people will also be looking at this asynchronously, later, given all the different time zones we're in. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great, yeah. So I'm Kat. I do a lot of small body science. I've been at the University of Arizona for a while now, did my PhD there. Mostly I do kind of combinations of dynamical and observational studies, which is what you'll be hearing about today, but I have interest in all sorts of different small body science and orbital dynamics problems, active small bodies, centaurs, comets, interest in a lot of things, which I know there's a lot of you that also have those interests. So I think that's briefly about my background. Should I go ahead and share my slides?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Get this set back up. So, okay, is that looking okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. So the topic for today is an overview of a couple different projects I've got going using the outer solar system small body populations to get at the dynamical history of the solar system. Specifically like what the giant planets did after they formed before they got to their current orbits. So I'm going to start with an overview just of the outer solar system populations, the transneptunian objects, then talk about why the TNOs in resonance with Neptune and those that are so-called dynamically detached or extreme objects are particularly interesting to constraining the solar system's past. Identify a few of the open questions that are related to some ongoing work I'm doing, and then end with just some thoughts about what's coming with LSST and what that means for outer solar system small body science. So to start with that overview, I always like to start simple. Here is a top-down view where we've got the giant planets' orbits in the white circles, and all of the dots are known observed transneptunian objects as of probably 2-3 years ago. So you'll immediately notice that a lot of the dots are relatively close in. That's because we obviously have a lot of observational biases. These are small bodies. We can only see them typically near their perihelion passages. If we take a side view, we start to see some vertical structure. There's a lot of objects that are pretty far out of the planetary plane. And again, there are some observational biases here where the surveys have tended to look mostly near the ecliptic or invariable plane. But we can account for those biases, and even amongst the observed populations, we see a wide range of orbital inclinations. So if we take a look at the orbital elements and dynamical classifications of, I think this is about 1,200 known TNOs that are observed. So the biases are still present in this, but we have them dynamically categorized. We start to see some of the important features in the TNO region. So top left is perihelion distance versus semimajor axis. Bottom is inclination versus semimajor axis. And then the right 2 panels are just log scales that we can start to see the more extreme orbits that we've observed. But the key features to note are those light blue classical TNOs. We see things that are on nearly circular orbits between about 40 and 50 AU in semimajor axis. There's that concentration. That's the classical Kuiper belt, that low inclination, low eccentricity disk that was initially kind of proposed for the region. although we can see in the bottom left that they do extend up to fairly high inclinations, that concentration at really low I is a real feature. We also see those vertical stripes in the semimajor axis plots. Those are TNOs in mean motion resonances with Neptune. So those are the locations where orbital periods have simple integer ratios to Neptune's orbital period, and we see these big pileups of objects in those resonances. And those have been identified by numerically integrating the observed orbits to confirm that they're actually dynamically in resonance. The red dots are the scattering population. You'll note they're all at relatively low perihelion distances. So those are things that come in close enough to have direct encounters with Neptune or sometimes even Uranus that cause their semimajor axes to do kind of a random walk over time. So it's a highly mobile dynamic population. And then we've got the light tan detached population, which I will talk a little bit more about later. Those are things who on 10 million year timescales have very stable orbits. They're not in resonance with Neptune on those timescales. They're not moving around in semimajor axis. They're so-called detached, though we'll talk a bit later about whether or not that's actually true. So, and you'll see that these extend out pretty far in the right-hand panels. And I've got those arrows there about the increase in biases. So it's very hard to detect things with really large perihelion distances. That's why there's just those 3 dots above perihelion distances of 60. Just the brightness limits get really difficult. And it is harder to detect things on really high inclination orbits, except in all sky surveys, because they spend so little time near the plane. So that's kind of a breakdown of the region. And the goal is to use all this complex dynamical structure to try to figure out how we went from the early solar system, where the giant planets formed closer together than they are today. And we generally think that, Uranus and Neptune were within 15 to 20 AU of the sun when they formed. And then they interacted with the remnant planetesimal disk and migrated to their current orbits, where we had Jupiter migrate in a little bit, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune spread out and move outwards. And that leaves us with the configuration we see today. How that leads to the Kuiper belt and the transneptunian populations there's ongoing questions about the details, but the broad brush strokes are that probably we had a very massive planetesimal disk that extended from around where Neptune formed out to about 30 AU, which is where Neptune is today. And that's the disk that fed the disk-driven, the planetesimal-driven migration of the giant planets. And that's why we think that massive disk probably had to stop at something like 30 AU, because that's where Neptune stopped migrating. So it must have either run out of stuff or had cleared a big enough gap to have stopped at that 30 AU mark. And then what we see out in the cold classical population between 42 and 47 AU today, we think is the remnant of an in situ population that was less massive, but formed out in that outer solar system. So if we go back to the classical Kuiper belt region, we can take our observations and debias them to come up with a model of what we think the intrinsic population looks like. And I'm showing here a debias model from the Canada-France ecliptic plane survey that has pretty much the broad strokes have held true, where we kind of have a 3-component classical belt disk. We've got that dense area called the kernel at low eccentricity and low inclinations, very centered around 44 AU. There's a so-called stirred population that kind of fills the rest of the red triangle and box I've identified. And then you have the hot population that extends up to higher eccentricities and inclinations. And the really interesting thing about these cold versus hot populations, where cold is dynamically cold, lower eccentricity and low inclination, is that they are physically distinct from the hot, higher dynamically excited populations. So like all of the dwarf planets in the TNO population belong to the hot populations. So there's no really big dynamically cold TNOs. We also see that there's a much higher frequency of binary objects in the cold population. At least 20% of them are binary. And in particular, they tend to be wide, equally sized binaries as opposed to a primary and a satellite. They also have distinctively red photometric colors that are different from that of the hot population. So this is all kind of leading to that idea that the hot population all came from that inner, more massive disk that formed at a different heliocentric distance. and these distinct cold classicals formed where they are today. So just step through a little bit of the observational evidence of this. This is a plot from Knoll et al. 2020 of where the known resolved binary objects are in the TNO populations. So it's the red triangles. There's also some blue stars for contact binaries. So you'll notice that the red triangles are much denser at the low inclination part of the cold classical belt. And of course, the most famous contact binary TNO is Arrokoth that New Horizons flew by, and that is a cold classical TNO. In terms of the colors, we've known for a long time that TNOs are very red, and that the cold classicals are on average redder than the dynamically hot populations. But as we've gotten more data and more filters, we've even now discovered that the cold classicals are red in a different way than the red dynamically hot populations. And this you can see pop out in a color plot. So here is from Pike et al. 2017, R minus Z color versus G minus R color. And that red highlighted region are the dynamically cold classical TNOs. And you can see that they kind of fall off of that continuum of the black triangles from the dynamically hot population. So it's hinting at these different surface properties. So this is all what's leading us to this idea, again, that we're looking at populations that formed in two different regions of the original planetesimal disk. So we've got the dynamically hot population that was scattered outward and emplaced onto their current orbits from that kind of inside 30 AU original disk. And then there's these cold classicals that formed in situ. It's hard to imagine that they were moved outward because their orbits are so dynamically cold. We don't think there was a ton of collisional evolution because that would have disrupted a lot of the fragile binaries we see. And they haven't been disturbed a whole lot since they formed. And they clearly have at least slightly different chemical compositions on the surface to explain those distinctive red surfaces. So we can use this information to help tease out the details of how we took that massive interior disk and turned them into the dynamically hot populations. So now I want to convince you why in those dynamically hot populations, why the resonant and detached TNOs are so interesting and are our best bet for getting good constraints on what happened to the giant planets. So in terms of why we're interested in the resonant TNOs, at 0th order level, there are just a lot of them. So you can see in this, same plot from earlier that there are a lot of those dark blue dots. So in the observed population, resonances are extremely frequent. But that's, of course, the observed population. The biases are very complex, especially for the resonant objects, because not only do you have the distance biases, the biases against inclinations, they also only come to perihelion at certain locations relative to Neptune. So you have to be very careful taking the observed resonant populations and turning them into an intrinsic estimate of the populations. But that's been done for quite a few of Neptune's resonances at this point. So I'm listing here just intrinsic population estimates for things that are roughly bigger than 100 kilometers. For a couple key resonances, the ones in red there are the resonances that are near or in that classical belt region, because we're going to come back to those. And then in black, those are the more distant resonances. But you see, those are some big numbers, thousands of objects in each of these individual resonances. And we don't even have population estimates for all the resonances. Some of them only have 1 or 2 detections, and it's very difficult to get population estimates from such small statistics. But we know that they're huge populations because we can compare that to estimates of the intrinsic scattering population, so those red dots in the figure. So the similar size estimate for the number of scattering TNOs is 90,000. So you can immediately see that there are probably more total resonant objects than there are scattering objects. So this is a very important population. It makes up a large fraction of the dynamically excited populations. And also because they are so prevalent in the observational data, we're going to have a good data set to compare against. From a dynamics perspective, they're very interesting because capture into these mean motion resonances is very related to the dynamical history of the giant planets. So if we go back to kind of the early models of planet migration, where we kind of imagine Neptune just smoothly migrating outwards as it scatters objects from this disk inwards. So that's what's in the upper left here, kind of the semimajor axis history for the giant planets in a very classical smooth migration picture. The locations of those resonances will also smoothly move outward as Neptune does. And as it moves outward, those resonances can pick up TNOs from the planetesimal disk that the resonances encounter as they go outward. So that's that original picture from Malhotra in 1995, showing that this kind of outward migration capture of Pluto into Neptune's 3-2 resonance could explain its dynamical excitation as it gets dragged along in the resonance. The resonant objects gain eccentricity and even inclination. And this is a really good way to populate the resonances. So the resonant populations are very tied to Neptune's orbital history. But in fact, the smooth migration process is so good at capturing things that it's actually inconsistent with observational constraints. If we just had one continuous massive planetesimal disk all the way out from where Neptune formed out to through the classical region and beyond, you end up picking up so many resonant objects that you can just rule out this scenario. You just can't migrate out into a cold disk. You'd pick up way too many things. But you can look at other scenarios more consistent with our modern picture. So thinking about this like truncated massive planetesimal disk that ends at 30 AU. So you have to scatter things out during the smooth migration and then pick them up into the resonances. And you get a different distribution of resonant objects and you get a lot fewer of them. So this is just an example from Nezhorny 2015. And you'll just notice there's way fewer things in the resonances in this kind of model than in the previous model where you're just picking up everything from a cold disk. And in those simulations, sometimes it works compared to the observations and sometimes it doesn't. But of course, there's more complex pictures of what happened to the giant planets. So if you take like the classical Nice model, where you have Jupiter and Saturn crossing a mutual mean motion resonance, and then scattering out Neptune and Uranus, and then migrating, you get a yet different distribution in these resonances. So, what you see in the resonances is very tied to exactly what did Neptune do during that outward migration. It's also tied to these really high semimajor axis, high perihelion detached objects that don't appear to be in resonances, but also aren't scattering off of Neptune. So some ideas for how you can produce these detached objects, they might be dropouts from Neptune's resonances. As Neptune's moving, if the migration was not particularly smooth, you can imagine things getting picked up into the resonances. You can get secular cycling within those that will lift their perihelia out of the planet region, and then you can kind of strand them. So that's one idea. There's also the idea that you could have ejected a rogue planet early in the solar system's history, and even relatively small things, Mars size, as they're on their way out, can dynamically interact with things and strand objects at high perihelion distances. That's the lower right plot here. The final blue squares are the orbits of these detached objects dropped off by a rogue planet in Gladman and Chan 2006. And of course, the recent thing is to say that maybe they're related to a planet that is still there that we just haven't seen yet, that could be raising their perihelia and also controlling the way their orbits are oriented. So that's the picture in the bottom left from that Badigan and Brown 2016 paper. There's also some ideas that you could have external perturbations from the sun's birth cluster shaping some of these really high A, high Q TNOs. So when the sun was born, we had many more stellar neighbors. It effectively brings the edge of the Oort cloud inward. Then when the cluster disperses, you could be left with a kind of fossilized inner Oort cloud that's no longer being perturbed, but is a remnant of that early perturbation. So there's a lot of potential explanations for these detached objects. You can't produce them in the current architecture of the solar system. So it's telling us something about the early solar system. So now I'm going to get into some of the open questions and the things I'm looking into in my current research. So I am particularly interested in really trying to get at the details of what Neptune's migration looked like. We have the big picture about this truncated massive disk the in situ formation of the cold classicals, and the fact that something besides just that nice smooth migration had to be what happened, because you can't explain all of the dynamical excitation or the fine scale details in the classical belt with just a nice orderly smooth migration. But there's a lot of details that we have not been able to convincingly pin down yet. So in this picture to the left is one plausible history for the outer solar system from Nesvorny and Morbidelli 2012, where we have the current giant planets plus an extra ice giant, so another Neptune or a Uranus that gets ejected at some point. So that's that vertical purple line being ejected that causes small jumps in the orbits of the remaining giant planets, which then causes them to interact with a planetesimal disk and slowly migrate to their final positions. So did Neptune have a jump like this? This is one of the things that's been proposed, for example, to explain that kernel that I showed earlier, that really high density area of low E, low I classical TNOs. So that's one plausible explanation for such a distinctive feature. But if Neptune did jump, where in its semi-major axis evolution did it jump? When did that happen? Then how long after that did it take Neptune to slowly end up at its final position? Because we do need some portion of smooth migration, we think, to explain the features we're seeing. Another big question is how grainy was that migration? So if you imagine that there were a lot of dwarf planet-sized things in that massive planetesimal disk, Neptune would experience a pretty big interaction every time it scattered one of those dwarf planets. So instead of just scattering many, many small things, having a smooth semi-major axis evolution, there should have been a little bit of back and forth and jumpiness to that migration as it's scattering these larger dwarf planets. But how many dwarf planets was it? How often did that happen? And that all affects the distributions that we see today. And then briefly, before I get back to those scientifically interesting questions, another question is, how much do our conclusions depend on the simplifications we have to make when we model these processes? Because of course, we can't model this disk-driven evolution perfectly. We tend to impose some evolution on the planets using just forces within the numerical integrator, because we can't just put in millions of massive particles into a true n-body simulation. It's just very difficult and computationally intensive to do. So we always have to worry in the back of our minds, we're simplifying the problem in order to study it. How much does that matter? And I bring that up because there has been some back and forth about this, where conclusions we thought were firm maybe aren't so firm. So example, in 2015, Nesvorny found that these really high orbital inclinations in the TNO populations could maybe be explained by that very slow last stage of Neptune's migration. Because he did a bunch of simulations and he found that the more slowly you have Neptune migrate to its final position after whatever happened with jumping or whatever, the more you'd excite the orbital inclinations of the final populations. So the plot I show in the lower left here was the strongest evidence from his paper, which was the distribution of plutinos, things in Neptune's 3:2 resonance, where there's this clear progression in all of his simulations showing that if you migrate Neptune fast, you get cold inclinations, and the more slowly you go, the more you pump those inclinations in the final simulated 3:2 population. And he made a very good case. He had a lot of simulations, so very good paper. But I had been sitting on some very similar migration simulations and was just puzzled because it was not at all what I saw in my simulations. So this is that same kind of plot, the inclination distribution of the plutinos. And I didn't find any dependence on the migration time scale. So my 10 million year migration time scale was the hottest inclination distribution. And 50 million years was dynamically colder. So it took several years actually to figure out what the heck was going on in these simulations that was giving us these conflicting answers about a pretty basic question. Does the time scale directly correlate to the inclinations? And it took a while to figure out because the answer was a little sneaky. So if you've had an orbital dynamics class, you might remember the idea of secular orbital dynamics. And this is where kind of the time averaged effect of the planets, where if you were to imagine them spread out in a ring instead of as point masses orbiting the sun, those rings perturb each other and cause the orbits to precess over time. And this precession happens in both the direction of perihelion and the eccentricity going in and out, lower to higher, as well as the longitude of ascending node and the amount of tilt in the orbit. So I'm just showing a toy model here, a simple analytical model for this evolution of the giant planets over time as they perturb each other. Now, what happens is then you can imagine the TNO populations outside of the outermost circle here. And those are also going to have some precession enforced by the gravitational effects of the giant planets. And if that natural precession rate matches the frequencies of one of the planet's dominant precession rates, then you get a so-called secular resonance that can really dramatically alter inclinations and eccentricities. And in fact, we can see the effects of that in the observed TNO distribution. So this gap in the inclination versus semi-major axis plot here between 40 and 42 AU is caused by the fact that TNOs with low orbital inclinations will precess at a rate that's resonant with Neptune's orbital precession rate, and it causes their eccentricities to shoot up and they get scattered out of the region. So you cannot have low inclination stable orbits in that region. And you'll note that it's actually really close to, it's on the inside edge of the classical belt. It's also really close to 3-2 resonance. And in fact, when you're looking at how things get scattered outward and then captured into the 3-2 in migration simulations, they tend to get scattered out and then interact with that secular resonance that can cause a dramatic change in the inclination over a couple million-year timescale. And then they get picked up into the 3-2 resonance at a high orbital inclination. So in fact, I did a bunch more simulations, and you get hot inclination distributions in the Plutinos and to a little bit lesser but still noticeable effect in the hot classical population if that secular resonance is particularly strong during migration. And if it's weak during migration, you get lower inclinations. So it's not directly tied to the time scale, it's instead tied to the strength of the secular resonance. And there's all sorts of things that affect the strength of that secular resonance that are related to how you choose to simulate the migration. It's particularly sensitive to Uranus's position relative to Neptune. It's sensitive to the exact inclinations of the planets during migration and whether you are numerically damping those inclinations and eccentricities as you are migrating the planets out. Because remember, all of this migration is happening with fictitious forces we made up to make the planets do what we want them to do. But it turns out it might matter what you make up and how you choose to do that. And in the real world, of course, also the TNOs would have mass, and that could affect these secular resonances. So we have to be pretty careful when we're thinking about our simulations and trying to figure out what are the broad conclusions we can draw from them versus what are the conclusions that are dependent on what exactly we've assumed. As Nesvorny and I made slightly different assumptions. Neither is correct. In fact, we're both simplifying. Neither is the real system. But it turns out that whether the inclination excitation is related to migration speed depends on what assumptions you made to simplify the problem. So we have to think hard about that. So that's a work in progress I've got with a grad student at UC Santa Cruz and some other collaborators. And we're doing a bunch of simulations to try to figure out, what aspects of the TNO distributions are least sensitive to these small differences in how you implement migration. And also the question of, how do you actually define a successful giant planet simulation? Usually we're just kind of eyeballing and saying, oh, those orbits look similar enough, it must be okay. Neptune's at about the right semi-major axis, the eccentricity looks okay, but no one's actually quantified that. So we're doing a huge suite of migration simulations where we're gonna just do the smooth capture because it's really numerically efficient, and do different end states that match the current giant planets either really well in, for example, like range of eccentricities. We're also looking at the secular structure and saying, okay, this matches really well, this doesn't match. How does that affect our captured TNO populations? And then we're also testing things like, does it matter if you just choose lucky initial conditions that land you when you're only forcing semi-major axis evolution to the correct final orbits, or if we're damping eccentricities. And again, none of these are what happened in the real solar system, but we're trying to get at which assumptions matter most. So that is a work in progress because it affects the next project I want to tell you about, which is using these very physically distinctive cold classical TNOs as a tracer population in our simulations to really get at the details. So once we figure out what simplifications do and don't matter, we are then going to look at a bunch of different migration scenarios. So including Neptune jumping, Neptune having Grainy migration, different timescales, and look at how the resonances interact with this cold classical population that we think formed in situ and therefore would have been there at the start of planet migration. And where do the objects from this physically distinctive population end up in the TNO population, and can we find them in the observed population? So we are focusing on resonances that are kind of on either side and within the classical belt for the first look at this problem. So this is the observational sample we're looking at on the right with some of the resonances, the 3 to 2, 5 to 3, 7 to 4, 2 to 1. Those are the big observationally occupied resonances that are near this cold classical population. And we're looking for these distinctive surface colors in the resonances. So this observational sample comes from the Outer Solar System Origins Survey, which was a large program on CFHT. Observations were primarily from 2013 to 2017. We looked at 8 different 21 square degree blocks on the sky down to 24 to 25 and a half in R-band magnitudes. We got 840 characterized TNOs, meaning we detected the objects and we have very well characterized the biases involved in detecting those objects. So we have a sense of the actual detection probabilities. They were all tracked so that we could get really high precision orbits that we know what dynamical classes they belong to. And then we have the OSIS survey simulator that you can feed a model population into, and it will tell you what OSIS would have detected out of that model population based on all of the limiting magnitudes in the different blocks, rate of motion on the sky, all of that sort of good stuff to really get at the biases so you can do a true apples to apples comparison between the observed objects and the simulated observed objects. And then a companion survey to OSIS was Colossus, Colors of OSIS, where they got a Gemini large program to get photometric colors of, I think, the brightest 25% of the OSIS detections. So this is what we're using as that marker for which objects have surfaces like those cold classicals. So left here is R minus J colors versus G minus R colors. This is just showing the resonant sample. That's from Pike et al. In prep. The first part of Colossus was released Schwamm et al. 2018. 2 papers to look forward to that I think are going to be submitted pretty soon. Fraser and Pike et al. Both in prep. And then you can also check out Wes Fraser's recorded DPS talk for more details. But in this plot here, you can still see those red squares showing those distinctive surface colors from the cold classical population. But then you'll note that there's some other dynamical populations that overlap with that region. So those are the kind of interlopers per se that we're looking for. And in particular, the first place we're really looking is the 2-to-1 resonance, because it is just to the outside of this physically distinctive population. And for any plausible Neptune migration scenario, that 2-to-1 had to somehow pass over or through that cold classical population to end up on the outer edge. So it's a really good place to look for how many of these distinctive surface property objects were picked up into the 2-to-1. So this is just going to show an animation of a really short, low resolution migration simulation, but it demonstrates that if you have Neptune migrating more than about 4 AU, and the resonance is passing through this cold classical region, and you can see the light colored dots that it's picking up as it goes, and it ends up at its final location at the end of the simulation. And all of those like pink diamonds are cold classical TNOs that got picked up into the 2-to-1 resonance during this migration. So we can use the OSIS survey simulator and say, okay, from this simulation, OSIS should have observed between 20 and 40 objects in the 2-to-1 resonance that have surface properties similar to the cold classical population. So that's a very robust test, and we can repeat this test for all sorts of different migration scenarios and say, this is how many objects we should have seen in the 2-to-1. And then we can expand it to the other resonances. But we really need to know the surface properties of those 2-to-1 objects that OSIS did detect. And we got surface properties for, I think, 3 of them from the Colossus sample, but that's a very small fraction of them. So we applied for and were awarded time on the LBT to measure photometric colors for another, we applied for 33. I think we got between 25 and 30 that we actually have observations of. And we got photometry in G, R, and Z bands so that we can do these surface color classifications. There are a lot of instrument issues. So we had quite the mix of instruments on LBT to get these colors. But we are in the process of getting all these colors analyzed. Here's just a few that have already been measured. So the teal diamonds here on this RZGR plot are a few of the 2-to-1 color measurements from the LBT. And we can see that they mostly fall onto the dynamically excited TNO kind of curve in that plot, as opposed to really within the cold classical region. So actually, even based on just this small handful, we can actually rule out, long scale smooth migration of the 2-to-1 through the classical belt region. So even with some not so great analysis of just a couple of these observations, we can say with 90% confidence, smooth migration did not happen throughout the whole region, which is not a surprise, because that kind of long range smooth migration fails to explain a lot of things. But it's a proof of concept that this is a very powerful test, even if you have pretty limited data, because the 2-to-1 is so good at picking things up. So analysis of the rest of the LBT data is underway. We got funding from an Emerging Worlds grant to do the data analysis. And we are in the process already of doing a bunch of different migration simulations so that we will have a lot of predictions for what the 2-to-1 should look like for various assumptions. And once we combine that with the OSIS survey simulator and all the color measurements, we're going to have a really robust test of the migration models, and hopefully have a pretty good handle on, did Neptune have to jump to reduce the capture into the 2-to-1, where that jump might have occurred, the timescale dependence for that late stage, and the amount of graininess. Because if you can imagine, if Neptune is having a lot of jumps in its semimajor axis, that will lower the capture efficiency into the resonances. So I'm really looking forward to getting all of those results. Another place where this graininess and speed affects what you expect to see is in these high perihelion detached or extreme objects. So on the right here, I'm showing some simulation results from Cave and Shepard 2016. And they were looking at grainy migration simulations. So they're allowing Neptune to experience these scattering events with larger dwarf planets. And they found that the how fast you're doing this migration with the graininess really affects dropouts from Neptune's resonances. So you can see the blue dashed lines are indicating the locations of Neptune's resonances. This is only going out to 100 AU. But if you do the migration fast enough, you're able to kind of keep things in the resonances. If you slow it down and have the graininess, you end up with a lot more of those sunward dropouts that were captured into the resonances long enough to have their eccentricities lowered and therefore get up to high perihelion distances. They got left behind by the resonances. So this is going to be another avenue to test that graininess and speed, is looking at the distribution of things that are in Neptune's resonances as opposed to sunward of the resonances that have dropped out, the range of perihelion distances they get to. But one of the problems with this is we actually don't have a great handle on how far out should we be looking for Neptune's resonances. Do they go out? Do they stop at 150 AU, 250 AU, 300 AU? Do we even know for the objects that we have observed, are their orbits good enough to know, are they actually resonant today? Or how far are they from the resonances? These are things we haven't quite been able to answer yet with the given data and dynamical studies. So I've been working on just kind of brute forcing this problem with numerical simulations to figure out, how far out do we even need to be still worrying about the resonances? Because at some point, if you go out far enough, the resonances might not persist because small perturbations could basically dominate over the resonant effects. The resonances at some point are expected to overlap with each other if you get far enough away from Neptune and the sun. At some point, external perturbations can wipe them out, galactic tides, that's stellar passages, that sort of thing. But we don't have good models of how far out the resonances go because our analytical models really aren't adequate. Most of our analytical models assume things are in the low eccentricity regime. So we're always doing power expansion, series expansions around eccentricity, but in the distant Kuiper belt, eccentricity is approaching 1, so you really can't do that anymore. So I've been working on some direct numerical simulations using a technique that's called surfaces of section. I'm only going to have a couple slides with torturing it with detailed orbital dynamics here. But what we can do is basically take a stroboscopic view of the dynamics. So we imagine here that this green circle is Neptune's orbit. The dot is where Neptune is when the TNO on the orange orbit is at its perihelion passage. And we can take a snapshot of its angle relative to Neptune every time it passes through perihelion. And we also record its semimajor axis at that point, because that's going to tell us these phase effects and resonant effects. So just to give you a quick overview of resonant dynamics, I'm going to show you a quick movie here of the 10-3 resonance. And we're in a rotating frame, so Neptune's going to stay fixed here. So we got semimajor axis eccentricity and a resonant angle on the left, and then a top-down Cartesian view. And the black orbit there is just tracing out 3 perihelion passages for the TNO, because that's 1 resonance cycle in an N-3 resonance. And you can see that those perihelion passages occur at distinct angles relative to Neptune. And if we look at longer time scales, they wiggle back and forth. That's the libration. And you can see that the semimajor axis is going up and down in the top left plot. In time with that libration, the eccentricity goes up and down. So in the surfaces of section approach, we are basically just recording at that perihelion passage exactly the semimajor axis and what is that angle between Neptune. Because when we do that, and then we look at a bunch of different test particles, so this plot, every different color is a different test particle. When you plot these values at each perihelion passage, all these resonant islands pop out. And it's just a really nice way to visualize what resonances are important and how wide a semimajor axis range they go over. So you can do this in a bunch of numerical simulations, and that's what I've been working on. You can measure the semimajor axis widths of the resonances from these plots kind of in an automated fashion, and you can start to see trends. So the left plots here are the widths of a bunch of N-1 resonances with Neptune, N-2 and N-3 at 2 different perihelion distances. So the top panel is a perihelion of 33, so nearly Neptune encountering. Bottom is a perihelion distance of 45, which would usually be considered solidly in the detached population, so it can't get very close to Neptune. And already we're seeing some surprises. First, the resonances go out really far. People have kind of bandied about that, maybe the resonances don't matter after about semimajor axis of 200 AU, but these are extending out to 4, 5, 600 AU. So clearly we can't just impose a cutoff. The other surprise is that as you raise the perihelion distance at a given semimajor axis, the resonances strengthen, which is kind of against our intuition. Usually we think resonances get stronger as eccentricity goes up, but we're not in the low eccentricity regime. Here, actually, the resonances get stronger as the eccentricity goes down. So it's a little counterintuitive, but when we're looking in the really distant populations, as we go to high A and high Q, you might still have some very strong resonances. And in fact, I've been examining the detailed dynamics. So those plots in the previous slide were from a simplified problem, but I've been looking at these surfaces of section in the full problem with the perturbations of all the other giant planets included in the regions around the 23 highest A, highest Q known TNOs. And half of them are quite possibly resonant. Only a like 2 of them can resonances be like completely ruled out as irrelevant in the region. A few more are interacting with resonances that probably can't have stable libration. So these are all things that have been called dynamically detached, but they clearly are still potentially interacting strongly with Neptune via Neptune's resonances. So kind of don't like the word detached anymore. You can't just make cuts in A and Q and have an idea of the dynamics. And I won't go into it, but this also affects the perihelion distribution, the directions, and this whole clustering debate with Planet 9. So basically don't count Neptune's resonances out. So they're probably more important than we've been assuming. We're starting to get answers. We need better observational constraints on the orbits to know, there's really big uncertainties on the observed semimajor axes. We need to knock those down. And we need better statistics, 10, 20, 30 objects is not really enough. So that leads me to my last couple slides here, looking ahead to the interesting science we're going to be able to do in the LSST era. So this is just an overview of current-ish state of TNO discoveries. The right hand is the differential in red and cumulative number of detections every year through about, I think, 2017. So, we have a couple thousand TNOs with well-known orbits at this point. And the left plot is just showing kind of the sky distribution in the RA and DEC of where our deepest surveys in yellow versus our much fainter, much shallower all sky surveys in purple. And when we have LSST, very notionally, we're going to have a huge portion of the sky covered to much deeper magnitudes. And the expectation is that instead of a couple thousand, we're going to have a couple tens of thousands of TNOs to play with. But from a dynamics perspective, we're not actually really prepared for that. Doing the dynamical classifications of TNOs has been done almost entirely by hand/eye up to this point. That's not going to fly with 10,000 objects. We want to know things like proper orbital elements, resonances, stability timescales, a better accounting of the orbit fit uncertainties so that we could populate a plot like this with the LSST detections, which isn't going to happen without some new tools. Because I can tell you, I've been responsible for most of the dynamical classification, and I'm sick of looking at thousands and thousands of orbital evolution plots to figure out how to color code these objects in a nice, pretty summary plot. And while doing numerical integrations has gotten much easier over the years, thanks to Rebound, we still need analysis tools. So this is a project I'm really excited about that I have seed funding for now, but I'm going to have PDART funding for in a couple weeks, is building a user-friendly Python package to do dynamical characterization, to take orbital integrations and actually analyze them to tell you the most dynamically relevant properties of an observed object, and do things like cloning within the uncertainty elements. You can say, it has a 90% probability of being in this resonance, and so on. So I'm really excited to be working on that tool also, because then people will stop asking me to do things for them once I write them some code that can do it. So just to wrap up here, to leave some time for questions, hopefully I've convinced you that the TNOs are really interesting. They've got complex orbital structures and complex distributions of physical properties. And that's really helped us tease out the broad brushstrokes of what happened in the early solar system. But we really haven't nailed down all the details yet. And I think the resonant and detached TNOs are going to be the keys to nailing down those details. And when we get those 10,000 TNOs from LSST, it's going to be a much bigger playground for constraining our dynamical models. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much, Kat. Questions? Go ahead and unmute. And
so Mark, I typed a question in the chat. This is Grace. So this is, I know very little about orbital dynamics, but I do remember several talks, maybe 10, 15 years ago, about the possibility of Uranus and Neptune swapping orbits in the early solar system when things were that closely packed. And I was wondering whether that had been discredited or there were still models that were looking at that and how that might affect some of the early evolution of the giant planets and the transneptunian, the TNO.
Yeah. Yeah, so I stopped screen sharing so I can bring back up that Nice model plot. Because yeah, it's the mid 2000s was that evolution. I'm just gonna share my whole messy screen so that we can just, come on, easier to find a specific slide. So hopefully you can see this plot here, this Levison et al.
Yes.
Okay, let me make it bigger. Yeah, so this is that original model, and you can see this is Neptune in the original simulation, and this is Uranus. So that is where that idea that they might have swapped came from. And I'd say this specific simulation has been pretty thoroughly discredited, just because of what happened with Jupiter and Saturn here. Doesn't actually produce the correct secular structure for Jupiter and Saturn. So this specific resonance crossing, which is tied to this specific, but the idea that you could have planets switching order is a valid idea. And especially in this kind of later simulation here, another really valid idea is the idea that we might have had an extra ice giant planet that ejected. So instead of, maybe swapping orders of the ice giants, we just got rid of one. And there's a variety of reasons you might prefer that. I think a lot of them are related actually to the inner solar system and the secular structure of the inner planets. I know one of the challenges in the Nice model was that it could have really messed with the orbits of the terrestrial planets if the terrestrial planets were there when these shenanigans went on. And it's the same idea of those secular resonances I talked about, where you could really pump up the eccentricities of the terrestrial planets. So I'm not as familiar with the most recent constraints on that, but I don't think there's any reason that Uranus and Neptune couldn't have swapped positions. And it would affect the TNOs depending on when it happened. If it happened before most of the residual long scale migration, that would have a different implication for the structure of the classical belt than if it happened late. So there are constraints on that, but I have not seen any specific predictions.
Great.
But it's still, there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
More questions?
Yeah, Kat, this is Jeff Morgenthaler. I am wondering your little plots of those islands of stability. Just, my intuition says, how hard is it to really land in one of those? Is that just because we have so many objects around that a few are just bound to fly into one? I guess this is all really dependent on Neptune with some perturbations of more inner planets. So as long as you think Neptune pretty well and it's not jittering around too much, then these just kind of sit there.
So in the current giant planet architecture, these islands are really well defined and we can understand them well. But yeah, that's actually a very relevant question of what are the odds of landing in the islands, because in addition to resonant populations picked up during the era of planet migration, there's also these so-called scatter sticking resonant objects that are just transient things from the scattering population that happen to have random walked into a resonance. They'll stick for some number of libration timescales, which could be, a billion years. They can stick for very long timescales, but then they scatter away. So those resonant objects are telling us about the current population, not the primordial. But yeah, you can imagine just comparing this plot near 2010 GB174. If you were to just throw a dart at this plot, you have a pretty decent shot of hitting a resonance. So there's probably a lot of sticking going on, but if you go over here to RA109, the resonances are fuzzier, more well separated. You can see that there aren't these higher order resonances. So if you threw a dot at this pot, you're less likely to hit one. So yeah, having these maps will help tell us where we think resonance sticking should be most important. So that is very relevant. Our problem right now is that these lines are the uncertainties on the real observed object. So this one has a huge orbital uncertainty. We just don't know its orbit that well. So knowing whether the current observed objects are or aren't in resonances requires some more follow-up observations. But from a theoretical standpoint, it's very useful just to have these maps to have a sense of what percentage of the phase space is resonant versus not. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Kat, this is Nalin. So when we look at Jupiter family comets, there are carbon chain depleted as well as the typical abundances. So with possible source as the scattered disk for Jupiter family comets, could there be some leakage from, say, other parts of the TNO population into the scattered disk due to migration of Neptune, for example?
Yeah. So one of the open questions is, of these distinctive cold classical surfaces, we know where they are today, but we don't really know how far in did that disk go in the early solar system. Maybe show it in this plot. So we've got, no dynamically cold orbits inside about 42 AU, but that doesn't mean that these similar composition objects didn't extend inward, and then that edge got created by the migration process. And some of those objects would have entered the scattering population as these, currently dynamically hot, but chemically dynamically cold.
Mm-hmm.
There's also just long-term leakage from the current population. There are a bunch of resonances, so you do get a slow leakage rate into the scattering population from the cold classical belt. And when we look at the colors here, we do see, so these black circles are dynamically hot non-resonant objects. They're probably scattering or hot classicals, and they look like they have the same surface properties as the cold. So we think both from migration and from today, there should be some cold surfaces in the dynamically hot populations, which then can end up in the Jupiter family comet population. So if we, the more we understand the JFCs, that will also be a really good constraint on this.
Okay, thank you.
So Kat, if we're looking at binary objects in these various populations, we've done a lot of searching in the cold classical belt. Is there another group of objects that we should be targeting next, so to speak, observationally?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to also have the constraints on the hot population. Let's pull up that binary plot. And those have been searched. I mean, in terms of finding the binaries, you're most likely to actually find them in the cold classical, but we do want to know the constraints in the hot population. But the problem is, when we don't find them in the hot population, it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't form as binaries, just because the act of emplacement by scattering off of Neptune can strip binaries. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to know the binary fraction of every single population. I guess,
but is there a particular resonance that we should be focusing on or something?
Yeah, the 2 to 1. Again, just like the colors are a tracer, binary objects in the 2 to 1 would be a tracer. It's just that it's harder because they're farther away. So you need bigger and bigger telescopes. But yeah, if you could search the 2 to 1 for binaries, that would be my next population to target.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Kat, what does the capture by Neptune of Triton, to what extent is that a constraint on all these models?
Not thought too much about that. That probably tells us, though, something. Triton's dwarf planet size. We'd call it dwarf planet size, right? Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So that must provide some statistical constraint on how many dwarf planets Neptune interacted with.
Well, I'll also think that maybe Neptune can or can't capture Triton if it's moving slow or fast.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I know there's been a lot of work on irregular satellite capture at like Jupiter and Saturn as a function of different migration scenarios. So in theory, you should be able to do the same kinds of studies with Triton capture. I'm not sure anybody's looked at that recently. I think the more, people have been looking a lot at the Neptune Trojan population. That's another constraint. So yeah, that's actually to talk to some of the people doing the irregular satellite capture, because I know that the distribution of the irregular satellites and the numbers you expect is somehow related to what Jupiter and Saturn did. I tend not to think too much about Jupiter and Saturn because only Neptune matters for the populations I'm looking at.
Right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, Kat, thank you very much. I mean, I love this stuff. This is great work.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's always fun to talk about and try to get more people to look at TNOs. So I've been an observer by necessity, but I don't really enjoy observing. But I want the data.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, so thank you.